Thank you. Appreciate the object lesson there.
Yeah.
That was very, very helpful. So glad that everybody could be here this morning. We've been working through a series on idols, different kinds of things that sometimes take the place of God in our lives. And so this morning we're going to talk a little bit about security. So I want to bring up September 11th, 2001, or simply 9/11 as it has come to be known. That changed everything for many people. For many people there was this, of course, sense of outrage and anger, there was loss and pain, but there was a great deal of fear. And that was one of the overwhelming emotions. People began to feel vulnerable for sometimes the very first time. There was a realization that terror could strike anywhere, at any time, and anyone. And it was a profoundly disturbing sensation for many people. Their sense of security had been challenged in this very deep way, to the very core. And now, if you reflect on it, you can recognize that we have a whole group of teenagers who have grown up in a world post 9/11 where that's all they've ever known is the threat of terrorism. And of course, we have, to add on to that, those mass shootings that happen at a disturbingly, alarmingly great rate. And that's what they know. Now, of course, the reality is that the danger has always been there, just around the corner, and that our sense of security and safety is somehow mostly an illusion. The fact that we can control things is mostly an illusion. And I remember actually thinking this when the storyline of 9/11 was happening, that they were this sense of, wow, this is so different. I thought, this stuff's been around forever. Maybe on the scope and the scale it was a little bit different, but it's not necessarily anything new. But I think, we're drawn to security. And it's fostered even when we're very young. As a child, of course, your parents work to keep you safe, and they try and keep all the harmful things of the world at arm's length to shield you from that. Whenever you had a problem or you were feeling ill, you'd go to mom or dad, or remember, especially as a very young child, we have some among us, right? They crawl up into mama's lap and they can feel that safety and security, especially when they're feeling sick. That children are mostly unaware of the dangers that the world presents, and we want it that way. We don't want them to have this constant sense of fear about things. We don't want them to constantly be afraid. Indeed, no one can live that way for long, that we need a sense of security. And it's something that we crave even from the earliest moments of our life. And so you might remember as a child that you would have perhaps a special toy or even a blanket. In fact, we use that phrase, at least in my generation, they called it a security blanket, right? Mine actually was called Blanky, for short. And it was funny because soon after Tanya and I, my wife, were married, we were visiting my parents, and I was down in the basement, and there was this old chest of drawers, and I opened it up, and there it was, tattered and torn and quite faded, my old Blanky, along with a bronze pair of my baby shoes. That used to be a thing where they would take your baby shoes, and I don't know why, but they did them, and there they were. So, in many ways, however, of course we put that blankie away, but we have other things that we replace it with to get that sense of security, because it's a desire that's quite natural. It's part of our sense of self-preservation. We want to be safe. We want to be in control. We don't like feeling vulnerable. We don't want things to be unpredictable. Yet it is a desire that can become an idol when we put our trust in our own abilities or perhaps in others rather than God, when we seek security from other things that are not God. And so this morning we're going back to the Old Testament to look at a story that illustrates this from Isaiah 31. And if you have a Bible, it would be really helpful to be there. And I need to give you a little background so that you'll understand the text that we're going to deal with. It's in Isaiah 31, but turn there and let me set the stage. The year is 701 BC, or perhaps slightly earlier, and the text is addressed to the king of Judah. or the kingdom of Judah, I should say. But to appreciate the story that we're going to tell, we have to go back a little bit earlier than that. And you need to recognize that we're now in the 8th century BC. And the power that dominated that world at that time was the nation of Assyria. And the Assyrians lived in the area of Nineveh between the Tigris and Euphrates, and near modern day Mosul in Iraq, and it stretched down toward also Babylon. And so the Babylonians had been an earlier power, but now Assyrians had taken control of things. And it became this dynamic empire by conquering all the nations around them. They were moving in all these different directions. And one of the strategies that they used whenever they would go into a new territory was to transplant the conquered people, to scatter them to various nations. And they would, the stories would instill fear of other peoples that had been conquered as they went into new territories, because they would typically slaughter a lot of the men, male of army age, and they would drag the women, even with hooks in their noses. They drag them by chains to these foreign lands and disseminate them to these various places. And so Assyria had to eye on the Mediterranean region because there was timber and there was trade, and they were trying to have a hedge against their enemies, especially the Egyptians. And so around 734, they were headed into the Syria and Israel area, and Damascus in Syria and northern Israel. Remember, at this time there were two kingdoms. There was northern Israel and southern Israel, which we call Judea or Judah, two kingdoms. So northern Israel and Damascus in Syria had gone together in an alliance against the Assyrians. And that, of course, was a horrible decision on their part. It didn't turn out so well. And they tried to force the king of Judah, Ahaz, to join them in this plan. Of course, he didn't want to. And so he appealed to the Assyrians for help. Another bad decision on his part. But when the Assyrians finally got around to dealing with this problem of resistance, they came into northern Israel in 721 or thereabouts, conquered North Israel, and used their strategy, which was typically to scatter those people to the various places around. And the 10 tribes of northern Israel at that point basically ceased to exist. Gone. Forever. Of course, this has been prophesied by many of the prophets in the Old Testament that this is going to happen. But now here we are in 705. So northern Israel's gone. We're down in 705 BC. And a new king has come to the throne in Assyria. And what happens oftentimes when the new headship comes is that the vassals underneath them, test the resolve. And so lots of revolts spring up to see if this new king's going to really enforce his rule. And so Hezekiah, the king of Judah, decided that he would no longer pay his tribute to the Assyrians, which again was another bad decision. And it seems he had made a deal with the Egyptians for protection, and that if the Assyrians were going to attack, that the Egyptians would come to their aid. And you're thinking, okay, well, what kind of deal would that be? Wouldn't that involve money? And so why are you paying money to the Egyptians when you could have just as easily paid to the Assyrians? Well, it's a business. But after spending a number of years consolidating his power, Sennacherib, the new king of Assyria, finally gets around to assaulting Judea, the kingdom of Judah. And it's somewhere in the midst of this impending threat where the prophecy comes that Isaiah utters here in Isaiah 31. And so let's read the first 3 verses. Alas for those who go down to Egypt for help, and who rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and horsemen because they are strong, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel or consult the Lord. Yet he too is wise and brings disaster. He does not call back his words, but he will rise against the house of the evildoers, against the helpers of those who work iniquity. The Egyptians are human and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, the helper will stumble, and the one helped will fall, and they will all perish together. You see, Isaiah is uttering a harsh word against the Jews because they have to turn to the Egyptians for protection and security. They believe the battle will be won because of a superior number of horses and chariots. Yet it is God who is their true source of security. And they have turned and trusted, in flesh and blood rather than spirit. Now, and this is ironic because every year the Jews celebrate Passover, which is a reminder to them of the way in which God had rescued them from their enemies, in that case the Egyptians, and brought them out of that slavery and that bondage with a mighty arm, had rescued them from the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. So they remember these stories. They remember of God acting on their behalf. Yet now, they're not looking to God for their protection. They're trusting in their own strength, in their own power, and they were trying to control their own destiny. They were using their resources and their limited abilities to try and protect themselves. And so Isaiah predicts that both the Egyptians and the Jews will suffer a similar fate to their northern cousins. In the end, we know that the Egyptian army was defeated at El-Takah, and at 46 of Judah's fortified cities were conquered. But Isaiah's prophecy does not end there. Look at verse 4 and following. For thus the Lord said to me, as a lion or a young lion growls over its prey, and when a band of shepherds is called out against it, is not terrified by their shouting or daunted at their noise, so the Lord of hosts will come down to fight upon Mount Zion and upon its hill, like birds hovering overhead. So the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. He will spare and rescue it. Turn back to him whom you have deeply betrayed, O people of Israel. For on that day all of you shall throw away your idols of silver and idols of gold, which your hands have sinfully made for you. Then the Assyrians shall fall by a sword, not of mortals, and a sword not of humans, shall devour him. He shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall be put to forced labor. His rock shall pass away in terror. His officers desert the standard in panic, says the Lord, whose fire is in Zion, and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. So you have this prophetic message by Isaiah that tells of God intervening so that Judah will not be completely overthrown. Like a lion fighting over its prey, God will not be frightened away by the shepherds. That represents the Assyrians. Instead, he's going to fight for his people. He is going to make sure that this terrifying scourge of the Assyrians is put to flight. Where the world saw this kind of great power, this overwhelming force, God would send away running. That was what Isaiah told the people of Israel. But for the people of Judah hiding behind the walls of Jerusalem, it was hard to believe. All they could see was the sea of the Assyrian army out before them. And their fear must have been palpable. You can envision how scared they must have been. In 2 Kings 18, we find this historical account of what takes place when Sennacherib's army actually arrives. And the people of Jerusalem are shaken because they see these vast forces laid before them. And the representative of Sennacherib begins to tell the people that they will eat their own dung and they'll drink their own urine. And he begins to taunt the Jews, and he says, what other God has rescued their people from our armies? Why is your God going to be any different? He is not going to deliver you. In fact, He's the one who sent us here. And so it's not hard to imagine their terror and their fear as they watch this army surrounding them. And as they ponder the stories, because the stories had circulated of what happened to other peoples who had been conquered by these armies. But things go very differently for the Jews. And in 2 Kings 19, beginning in verse 35, we find this story about what happens. We find that the Assyrian army is struck down in their camp by an angel of the Lord, and Sennacherib mysteriously withdraws his siege. And this scene is actually confirmed for us by the historian Herodotus. He says that it was a plague of mice that forced the lifting of the siege. How ironic if this is true. The Jews had trusted in chariots and horses of the Egyptians. But God instead uses a plague of mice to send the army fleeing. But it's a story, I think, that serves as a warning for all of us. I think too often, we rely on our own strength and the multitude of our chariots. We ignore the one who can provide true security for us. I think, when we're young, it's easy to perhaps trust in God and God will provide because we're used to that. We've been provided all of these things by our parents, and we see God as just kind of a glorified parent. And since we're so vulnerable, we don't have anything, we're constantly looking to God and trusting in Him. But as we step out into the world, as we graduate from high school and college, and as you get a job, and as you begin to maybe even start a family and provide for yourself, I think sometimes we seek to gain more control over our world. We don't like the uncertainties of life. We don't want the world to be unpredictable, and so we try and make it more controlled and predictable. We want to feel safe. We want to feel assured that we know what's going to happen. And so we make plans. We want to have that same security we felt when we were younger. We want that security blanket back so that we can cover ourselves with it. And so we begin to define security in all kinds of ways other than God. And we define it as having lots of money in the bank. We define it as having a secure job and a retirement program and insurance and being able to pay the mortgage and not having any debts. And that's security. Knowing what's going to happen. That's security. Now, all of these things are not wrong to pursue, and please don't hear me say that I don't want you planning for the future. I want you to have insurance. I want you to pay off your debts. I want you to do all of these things, but don't trust in that. Right? I think there's a tendency sometimes to trust in these things, to think that we can control our lives, that we can keep bad things from happening, and if something bad happens, that we can fix it. But sometimes bad things just happen. In fact, this kind of thinking is reflected in a parable Jesus once taught in Luke chapter 12. He talks about this man who had such a great harvest, and he couldn't fit all of it in his barn. And he's like, what am I going to do? I have too much grain for my barn. I know, I'll just build a bigger barn. And then I can sit back and be happy and eat. Think, wow, you've got lots of grain and lots of food for many years. And what he didn't realize was he was going to die that night. He didn't have control over the very most important thing, life itself. See, life is far more unpredictable than we realize. And no matter how much we might plan, there's just too many variables for us to control. Things can happen no matter how much effort you try to invest in avoiding bad things. And God calls us to place our security in Him alone. Only in God can we find our true protection. Now, don't misunderstand me and think that I'm saying that if we trust in God, bad things won't happen. That's not the point either. God doesn't promise us that bad things will not happen. Jobs are never guaranteed. Marriages do falter. The economy goes south. Sometimes you just can't not have bad things happen. We can't control these things. Health is going to fail. You're going to get sick. People are going to die. We can't control any of this. But sometimes those very things, jobs and family and money, can become barriers to us learning to trust in God. They become illusions that we have control, but we're never truly in control. In fact, as Christians, we're called to recognize that in some cases, we're called to live lives out of control, where we're not in control. As Christians, faith in God must be at the center of who we are. When we make security our central pursuit, we have taken our focus off of God. And we perhaps miss what God has in store for us, because we're making the plans and not Him. You see, following God means being willing to take risks. It means not knowing what all the answers are. It means walking down paths where you don't know the end to it, where you can't see where it's headed, but you just trust that God will guide you. It means saying yes to things even when you don't have everything figured out. Following God might mean giving up your job. It might mean leaving that place you love, because God has something else in mind. It means relinquishing control so that God might be in control. Trusting in God means giving up blanking, letting Him give you that peace and security. As Christians, we find our security not in knowing that everything's going to go just so, but in realizing that no matter what happens, good or bad, God will be with us. That even in the bad stuff, something beautiful can result, that He can make good come out of those things. Because we as Christians live with this eternal perspective. We recognize that it's not about this world and this life and this day, but it's far bigger than that. And that there's far more to this world and to our lives than what we can see. And that our plans are sometimes far too small for what God has in store. So I want to end this morning with a story. A story about a family I know who I think embody this principle. Kevin and Benet Bloom are some missionaries that I know. Back in 1994, Kevin was trying for the second year in a row to get into physical therapy school. He had been rejected a couple of times. He was teaching gymnastics. His wife was teaching school. And for the second year in a row, he was applying to this school in Memphis. But he had this opportunity to go on a mission trip to the Ukraine. And so he goes on this mission trip not knowing what's going to result. And while he's over in the Ukraine, he gets word that there's potential interest by the school in Memphis for him to become a student. So when he returns, he finds out that he's finally been accepted. And it's been such a long wait and such a long struggle to get in. And he finally finishes school, and he's now working as a physical therapist in Mississippi. And he's enjoying what he's doing when all of a sudden he gets this magazine from his old college called Church and Family. And in this magazine, there's this advertisement for a mission team that's being formed to Brazil. And he doesn't know anything about it. It's just something about this intrigues him. And he feels the call of God. And you see that trip to the Ukraine earlier, that mission trip that he'd just taken on a whim, had sown a seed in his mind and in his heart. And so when this opportunity arose, he felt compelled. But when he shared this dream with his wife and 4 kids, they weren't as compelled. They weren't as excited as he was. In fact, she didn't want to go. And all of their friends were in shock. Like, wait a minute, you spent all that time trying to get into physical therapy school, and you finally did that, and you finally got through, and now you want to give all that up? That doesn't make any sense. What are you going to do? How are you going to survive? You got 4 kids. And so his wife began to pray about it. She began asking God to send her the right people and the right words to encourage her. And it eventually changed her heart. Listen to some of the words that she says. She says, God taught us what it means to act on faith and not on sight. If you can see every step laid out before you, you don't need faith. We joined a mission team, not having enough money raised to go to Brazil. Kevin quit his job without us having enough money raised. We even bought our plane tickets before we had enough money raised. It was only a month before we left that we finally got enough. And then they went. But she says again, I don't think God is through teaching us that acting on faith lesson because we have to do this so much in so many areas of our lives. It seems like it's all about letting go and simply trusting. But it feels like we're on this fun and scary roller coaster, and we don't want to get off until God says the ride is over. Well, they've been in Brazil for 14 years now, and they have 7 children. And they're not supported by any one church. They've got people all over the country, little families and lone widows that put in checks every month. And over the years, some have dropped out and some have come back on, and they never knew exactly how it was all going to work out. But 14 years later, they're still there because God hasn't said, get off the ride yet. They've often lived not knowing where their support would come from, but they've trusted in God, and they know that God was there supporting them. I invite the praise team to come up. As we close, I want to make a couple of things clear. Again, I'm not advocating no savings, no bank account, no retirement, no insurance. I'm not saying any of that. But we must realize that as Christians, life is outside of our control, no matter how much we try to control it. We can't put our trust in our plans and in our designs. Our trust must be in God alone. We have to be open to taking risks. You see, true security is learning that we're safest when we are truly out of control. Let's praise God.